Welcome to this, the 16th meeting in 2014 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I remind everyone present, please, to turn off or at least turn to silent all mobile phones and other electronic devices so they don't interfere with the sound equipment. We have no apologies this morning, so welcome to everyone for coming along. Today we have one item on our agenda. We are continuing our inquiry into Scotland's economic future post-2014. We have two panels of witnesses this morning. I'd like to welcome our first panel. With us we have the Right Honourable Alistair Darling, MP, who is the chair of the Better Together campaign, and he is joined by Blair McDougall, campaign director. Welcome to you both. Now, we have around 90 minutes for this session, so we have some time in hand, but I would remind members, if they would, to keep their questions as short and to the point as possible, and answers as short and to the point would be helpful in getting through the topics in the time available. And I'm sure you've been following our committee inquiry and you'll be aware of the likely issues that will come up in the course of the session. I wonder if I could just start maybe by asking you, Mr. Darling, if you could say maybe no more than 2 or 3 minutes, why you believe it's in the interests of Scotland's economy that there is a no vote in the referendum in September.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting us to appear before your committee. I think the main economic argument for Scotland remaining part of the United Kingdom is the fact that we have unimpeded access to a market of over 60 million people. Now, that's important for Scottish firms, large and small, because we sell more to the rest of the UK than we do to the rest of the world put together. And that opportunity, the strength that comes from that, is very, very important because it's these firms that will create the wealth that Scotland will need to look after its people, to ensure that we can enjoy an increasing standard of living. It's also important in terms of jobs, especially at a time like this, when we are just emerging from one of the deepest and most profound economic downturns that the world has seen, and certainly this country has seen. That we capitalise on the fact the economy now appears to be growing and that we have those job opportunities that come with that. I think the other thing that I think is important in terms of the security, if you like, that the larger United Kingdom provides for us, it means that in relation to pensions, for example, where in Scotland our population is ageing rather more quickly than it is in the UK as a whole, and because of the fact that that burden can be shared amongst a population of over 60 million, that is of immense help to us. And of course, there's also the security that, if you're hit by an unexpected shock to the system, as we were 6 years ago in relation to the banking system, you have that as well. So my view is that at the moment we do have the best of both worlds. We've got this Scottish Parliament responsible for many of the things that affect us in our day-to-day lives in terms of education, in terms of transport, in terms of health. But we're also part of something bigger, which benefits us as individual Scots. And I think that is very, very important. And although there are other arguments, emotional arguments that are equally important, I think the economic arguments are the ones that drive me, and I believe the majority of people, to the view that we are better and stronger as part of the UK.
And thank you for setting the scene briefly, and I'm sure a lot of the issues you mentioned we'll explore further in terms of the questioning. Can I just ask one follow-up question? You mentioned the banking crisis 6 years ago. You were the Chancellor of the Exchequer at that time. What difference do you think it would have made to your position then, had instead of being Chancellor of the UK, you had been the Finance Secretary in an independent Scotland?
Well, I suppose the big difference is that we had the firepower to prevent the banking system from collapsing. As I've said on many occasions in the past, on the 7th of October in 2008, I was phoned by the then chairman of RBS, and that morning it had seen a run on the bank, a run on its shares. Its shares had been suspended by the stock exchange twice, and we had a plan ready to go for recapitalising RBS and the other banks, but it wasn't quite ready yet. And when I said to Sir Tom McKillop, well, how long can you last? He said, well, maybe the early afternoon. And at that time, RBS was probably the biggest bank in the world. Its balance sheet was about 1.4 trillion pounds, which is roughly the size of the UK's GDP. Now, this is where credibility is important. When we announced the next day that we were going to recapitalise RBS and HBOS and also make money available to other banks as well, people believed that we were big enough to do it because we had that credibility. Now, I contrast that with the telephone conversation I had with my Irish counterpart at that time, who said to me, that the Irish government had effectively just underwritten the deposits in 3 Irish banks. And I remember saying to him, but they're much bigger than you are. And he said, well, I hope no one notices. Well, they did notice quite shortly after that. And unfortunately, Ireland, along with Iceland, were brought down by the weight of their collapsing banks. Now, I hope we won't get to a situation like that again. But the lessons that I drew from that, leaving aside how it arose in the first place, is if you want to stop a crisis like that, you have to do more than people expect, and you have to do it more quickly than people expect. Something the Eurozone, for example, has conspicuously failed to do, because it doesn't have that firepower available in relation to Greece, for that matter. So the strength that comes from being a larger country, plus the fact on that day, the governor of the Bank of England spoke to the chairman of the US Fed and said, please make sure RBS doesn't collapse during the course of that day by making temporary funds available, which had to be repaid, of course. He did that, and he didn't ever ask, well, can you afford to do it? So it was actually, if we had not been the UK, if we'd just been Scotland, the Scottish GDP in relation to RBS would have just brought the whole country down, and it would have been catastrophic. We'd have ended up having to go to the IMF as Ireland's had to do.
When you hear people on the other side of this debate saying, but in the event of a bank failure, other countries' governments would come in and support the banks, I mean, is that a credible response to you?
No, it's not. And, I was there at the time, and I don't remember lots of people phoning up saying, can we come and help bail out your banks? If you come to the recapitalisation of UK banks or any country's banks, that falls very much on the country where the brass plate happens to be. What is available on a temporary basis is the temporary funding, the liquidity funding as it's called, to keep a bank going on that day. But central banks can only provide that liquidity if the bank concerned is solvent and a going concern. Now, if I mentioned the US Fed, all they needed to know was we intended to recapitalise RBS overnight, so there wasn't a problem in relation to that. But I've read elsewhere that people said, "Oh, but the Americans paid." Well, they didn't. They did no more than we did. Banks in London access the Bank of England Special Liquidity Scheme, but they do it at some cost because they, and to use the banking jargon, they take a haircut for doing it, and it's quite an expensive thing to do. But the actual capitalisation, which RBS had nearly £50 billion, that came from the UK taxpayer, and that is presently to be found as part of the debt we presently have at the moment. So I'm afraid there was no one clamouring to recapitalise these banks. That's the argument in Europe just now, because they don't have a proper banking union, and there's this big argument. Germany is saying, why should we put money into southern Mediterranean countries' banks and so on? If you can't do that, you lead to inherent instability, which is why people are a bit concerned about the state of the Eurozone at the moment, because they don't have that sort of efficient system that you obviously have as a sovereign state.
Chick, before you follow up on this.
Very interesting point. Good morning, by the way.
Hello.
You said that there's not a credible thought that the problem falls very much on the country where the plaque happens to be. Who bailed out Barclays Bank?
Didn't go to any government. They raised money mainly in the Gulf. And I go back to, it's a perfectly reasonable question for you to ask. In the scheme that we put in place on the 8th of October 2008 was that firstly the FSA, which was then the regulator, had to assess for each bank how much capital they needed. And if they needed more capital, the first place to go was to the private market. And if they couldn't access the private market, then the government would provide it. So if you take HSBC, for example, it didn't need very much at all and raised it itself. Barclays decided as a matter of principle they would not take money from the British government for various reasons.
Bailed out by the Qatari and the American governments, which flies in the face of what you're saying, that the responsibility falls very much on the country where the plaque.
No, that's not quite true. They raised money in the Gulf from what were sovereign wealth funds, but it was not, you know, the Qatari government per se, although, you know, obviously their wealth funds are heavily influenced by these governments. But equally, the money that they raised from America didn't come from, you know, the US government as such. It came from American institutions. So, you know, it's quite different from the situation with RBS and HBOS, or Lloyd's HBOS as it was about to become, simply because they had to come to the UK government because nobody else would lend them money because, bluntly, they were bust. Barclays was not bust, it was solvent and was able to raise money in a way that any other financial institution or any other company can do that at the same time.
I suppose we can all put a different slant on it.
I should say to Blair McDougall, if you want to come in at any point, just catch my eye. Like you, this is probably, you know, like me, this is probably above your pay grade, but, you know, it certainly feels above my pay grade, these discussions. Yes, thank you. Right, I'll bring in Dennis Robertson.
I think I'm probably even a lower pay grade than Murdo, but I don't know. Good morning, gentlemen. I'll maybe come back to some of your opening remarks in a second, Mr. Darling. But first of all, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, has said that those supporting yes will always be able to come up with examples of small, independent, successful economic countries, you know, that sort of thing, like, you know, Finland, Switzerland, Norway. And then he was saying that, you know, of course Scotland can be a successful, independent country. Do you agree with David Cameron?
I don't think size determines your economic success.
You'd agree with David Cameron saying that Scotland can be a successful, independent country. He didn't use small.
Well, but I think in your preamble to your question, you were talking about large and small countries, and, you know, my position is quite clear. I mean, it's not your size that determines what you do. Clearly, if you are a smaller country, the evidence tends to suggest you have to run a tighter fiscal policy than otherwise, that you might otherwise do. And if you look at you know, countries like Denmark, for example, they have higher tax rates than we do. They as a matter of policy, they shadow the euro. I think it's in relation to Scotland. As long as you're prepared to cut your cloth according to your means, and as long as you understand there may be things you can't do. What I'm answering the question my way rather than you know. It is, but you know, I hope my answer is relatively simple as well. But, you know, I've never taken the position that somehow you can't do it. What I have said, if you do it, then you can do it, but you need to be straightforward about the consequences, about what that means in terms of your tax and spend policy, in terms of what risks you can take on and what you can't do. So, you know, I don't think size isn't the issue. It's actually how you run your country, if you like, and, you know, I suppose in this day and age, how you're perceived to run your country in terms of, you know, credit risk and so on.
You've got caveats in terms of what David Cameron said, that of course Scotland can be a successful independent country.
Any country can be successful, and as I say, size doesn't matter. However, I mean, if you take, you know, let's get on to the point in relation to Scotland, whereas, you know, in the last 20 years and every year bar one, Scotland has been running a deficit. Now, if it became independent, it would clearly have to do something about that. And you'll be aware of the IFS report that was published last November, which pointed out that we have, as I said earlier, a rising ageing population. We have a relatively falling working age population. They've made the point, in order to reduce the deficit that Scotland would inherit as part of any settlement, but in order to make sure that you were running a fiscal policy that was credible, there would have to be some changes. Now, you know, if that is a position that you take as a matter of principle, which I assume you do, that's fine, as long as you tell people what the consequences of that are.
The white paper in itself, Scotland's Future, and basically it set out, you know, the aims of what a Scottish government would be taking forward. A couple of points that you made in terms of the you know, exports, etc. You will be aware that, you know, in terms of what's happening within Scotland at the moment, we're actually punching well above our weight in some respects, and there was some question as to whether investment might dry up in Scotland if we were to go ahead with a referendum. You're aware that Scotland has had one of the most successful years in terms of investment coming into Scotland.
Look, firstly, I mean, I'm sure you and I will disagree about whether or not we accept the white paper published last November as being the gospel or not. I mean, there are some things in there that I think are open to dispute. In relation to investment, what I would say is that, firstly, Scotland, yes, we have done well. For some time. Indeed, the whole of the UK has been one of the world's, it has been the #1 destination for foreign direct investment for some considerable time, and Scotland has benefited from that. Where the problem would arise in relation to investment is, firstly, in relation to any uncertainty arising from a yes vote in September in relation to what our arrangements were in relation to currency, in relation to debt, in relation to how we allocate responsibility for pensions, our membership of the European Union. Wherever you've got uncertainty, as I think members of the committee will accept,
Mr. Darling, people that are investing in Scotland at the moment are well aware that there's a referendum. They've been aware that there's going to be a referendum for some time, and they're still investing.
Well, no, that wasn't the point that I was making. I said if there was a yes vote, and consequences naturally follow from that, because if that happened, then independence would be inevitable rather than possibility.
There's going to be a no vote or a yes vote? They've invested regardless, surely. No,
I'm not saying that. You were asking me about uncertainty, and I was saying that the uncertainty that we were likely to hit investment is that in the event of a yes vote, you would get a whole range of uncertainties. Now, as I say, as a matter of principle, you believe in an independent Scotland. But I got that one right. However,
already.
Well, yes, and for the sake of completeness, I don't. So there you are. But in relation to when you've got uncertainty and you've got risks, you've got costs, and that's where I think that it would be damaging in the longer term. In relation to investment, it would all depend upon, as I say, fundamental questions like what currency we will be using, our membership of the European Union, the terms and conditions, and so on.
To my original point, Mr. Darling, and please, I mean, what I'm saying is, are you suggesting that all these companies that have been investing in Scotland, record investment in Scotland at the moment, are doing so thinking that, they invest for 5, 10, 15 years ahead. They're not just investing for tomorrow or for the outcome of a referendum, the 18th of September. They're investing because they know that Scotland is going to be a successful, economic, perhaps independent country.
Nobody knows because we don't know the outcome of this referendum.
I'm saying they've invested regardless.
They have been investing. I'm not going to repeat everything I said about where I think the uncertainty comes in, but I'd also make the point they have been investing in Scotland for the last few years, knowing that Scotland is part of the United Kingdom, that if you invest in Scotland or a Scottish firm, that firm has got unimpeded access to sell to a market of 60 million as opposed to 5 million, and they know exactly the terms and conditions in which the UK is a member of the European Union. What I'm saying to you is that if Scotland were to vote to become independent in September of this year, then many of those certainties would become uncertainties, and that's where your risk to investment comes in.
Okay, right.
Okay, Mr.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, Richard Baker.
Thank you, Convener. I can highlight my declaration of interest as a member of the board of Better Together. Mr. Darling, my questions around financial regulation. We've taken a great deal of evidence over the course of this inquiry on the issue of financial regulation. Of course, a separate Scotland would have to establish its own financial regulator. What challenges do you think this would bring if Scotland was in that situation with its own regulator? And also, not just looking forward but looking back, some people have said that if Scotland had its own financial regulation prior to the banking crisis, it would never have happened in a separate Scotland, and I wondered if you had any views on that.
Well, firstly, in relation to setting up your own regulatory regime, I suppose the obvious challenge is setting up something that's brand new in an environment that is still pretty turbulent. You also have a major challenge where you have a financial sector that is about 12 times the size of Scotland's GDP. And that, I think, would be a formidable challenge you'd also, one of the big decisions you'd have to reach is to what extent would the regime here be different to the rest of the UK? Now, obviously, given the relative size of the sector to Scotland, you might, for example, have to say that banks need to hold more capital than otherwise. That affects their ability to lend. You might well want to have a different regime. Indeed, I know that you've taken evidence, and there have been many people who've given evidence in various committees and other hearings as well, who've made the point that the regime might well have to be, rather more tight, if you like, than it is south of the border. So, I think that would be one of the biggest challenges. One of the other things is that at the moment, the UK is one of the world's leading regulators, whether it's the FSA or now under the auspices of the Bank of England. And that does give us a lot of influence. If you look, the main regulators are largely the Americans, ourselves, the Europeans, although it's rather fragmented at the moment, because they have in the past been hugely influential on what their overall regime looks like. That matters to Scotland because one of our strengths in Scotland is we are, I think, the 4th or 5th biggest financial centre in Europe, but actually we're one of the few financial centres outside the really big ones that, in addition to banking, pensions and insurance, we've got a lot of asset management and so on. So it's actually very, very important for us what the regime looks like. Where it would directly bear on Scotland is how would it affect a firm based here, like Standard Life, which sells about 90% of what it does to south of the border, where you'd have a different regulatory regime, therefore there would be a cost in trading across the border. What would it mean in terms of asset management and banking and so on? So, yeah, there'd be, nothing in this life is impossible, but there would be additional costs, uncertainty, and also, I suspect it would knock into negotiations with the European Union. In relation to what would have happened if we'd been a Scottish regulator, well, it's very difficult to say. Although, I do know that the First Minister, writing in the Times just before the 2007 election, I came across this quote in which he said that we are pledging a light touch regulation suitable to a Scottish financial sector with its outstanding reputation for probity. Now, that was 2007. Let me say now, before the rest of you get stuck in, there were many mistakes made in relation to the regulatory system in the UK, in America, in Europe, you name it. Because too often the regulators were simply accepted the word of the banks they were regulating and other institutions that everything was okay. However, as I've said on many occasions, yes, regulators, and therefore the governments responsible, must shoulder their share of the blame, but the primary responsibility for the conduct of any firm is the board of directors. And unfortunately, the decisions that led to the collapse of RBS were made by RBS here in Edinburgh, as they were in HBOS, unfortunately, made here in Edinburgh. Both these banks were brought to their knees and have collapsed because of bad decisions. And, I think it's really, if you look at what was being said at the time in 2007, when light touch, which incidentally is a term I've never advocated, it was being used all over the place by all the political parties at the time, and we were paying a very heavy price for it.
We all accept the need tighter financial regulation, but what you said at the beginning of your question, and that would be particularly stringent in the context of a new financial regulator in Scotland with a very big financial services sector. So is your argument that would actually make a situation of access to lending even more difficult in Scotland, where many businesses say it's already very difficult for them to get access to lending which they need?
It's true that the more capital a bank has to hold, the less capital it's got for lending. Now, don't misunderstand me. We've got to make sure our banks are much better capitalised than they were. I mean, RBS in 2008 was running on today's equivalent of about, it had 2% capital, whereas it ought to have been, between 10 and 12%, which is why it was so vulnerable when it bought ABN, which, led to eventually brought the thing crashing down. And obviously that does have an impact. It will have an impact across the UK as a whole, because people are now seeing banks having to hold more capital. The other thing is that, I don't think, if Scotland was independent, there is no way that we would not have to run a pretty strict regime, because you couldn't peril the entire country on the possible folly of, a financial sector that was 12 times bigger than you were. And look what happened to Ireland or Iceland. They were completely, done over by the fact they did not have proper control over their financial institutions. So, you know, we would have to run a far more tight regime. The other thing, you know, it's one of the things that when most of these institutions raise money internationally, particularly in the United States, people will increasingly look, and I suspect this will be true for the next 100 years or so, on not just who are you if we're going to lend you money, but who stands behind you. Who is your central bank? And what's the central bank worth? And the central bank, frankly, is worth only as much as the country. The Bank of England doesn't have very much money of its own. It's really just routine stuff. All the support that was given to the Bank of England, through the Bank of England, either through capital or through support, every one of it has a letter signed by me guaranteeing the Bank of England every last penny that it spent. And that's why it's the creditworthiness of the government that actually very often determines the creditworthiness of an institution. So yeah, it would have to be much, much tougher, I think. And you know, obviously, the more costs you add in the regulatory regime, the less money there is to be going elsewhere.
And finally, on the issue of the Bank of England being Scotland's lender of last resort, potentially, and the proposal for a currency union, many of people have questioned the wisdom of that approach, which the Scottish Government has brought forward, not least the Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, who's made the very points you've made about the size of Scotland's financial sector compared to the rest of its economy. And of course, even people in Yes Scotland have questioned the wisdom of that proposal. But is it your view that on this proposal for the currency union, the sterling zone, that it's simply not politically acceptable to the rest of the UK or not on their interests, or do you think it's something which actually wouldn't be in Scotland's interests either if we were to be a separate nation?
Well, that's a big question. I'll try and do what Mr. Fraser asked and give you a succinct as possible answer. The first thing to keep in the front of your mind is that when we talk about the Bank of England being the lender of last resort, which technically it is actually the government that is the lender of last resort. Because whether it was Northern Rock, RBS, or any of the other banks, the special liquidity scheme, the various other schemes the bank operated, the lender of last resort was the UK government. And similarly, if you look at, if you look at America at the moment, the US Fed is the lender of last resort, but it's actually Uncle Sam. It's the US government that people look at. So it would not be up to the Bank of England to say yea or nay to such a proposal, but it would be up to the government that stood behind the Bank of England as to whether it would do this or not. I think the way that I look at a currency union is I look at it from the economics of the thing. I mean, you can't ignore the politics because politics enter into most things in life. And you know, I look at it from Scotland's point of view. Even if one was on offer, which it isn't, you would be in a position where, in order to guarantee a currency union, you'd really have to sign up to anything that your other partner and then its enterprise was insisting upon. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a deal. And you know, as someone who is Scottish, if there was an independence vote, I would be disturbed if the country in which I then lived was in a situation where it had to sign up to a whole bunch of conditions on tax, spending, borrowing, undertakings not to compete on tax or whatever else they might throw into the works. I think that would be very bad for Scotland. Equally, from the rest of the UK's point of view, a currency union only works if you've got a substantial degree of economic cooperation. You need, as Mark Carney said earlier this year, to have the ability to transfer funds from the better off parts to the poorer parts. He said maybe 25% of GDP. And critically, you need a banking union. And what you'd be saying to the rest of the UK is you've got to underwrite, both countries in theory underwrite both sets of banks, but it's a very asymmetrical relationship simply because of the size of the Scottish financial sector. Now, I think for those economic reasons, the whole thing doesn't stack up. Now, there is the political overlay because if I think, if the two countries were to break apart, there would be, politics would enter into it, just like politics enters into every aspect of life. But it's the economic test that I think it fails, which is why I don't think it would work.
Mr. Mackenzie's got a follow-up on this question.
Good morning, Mr. Darling.
Hello.
Don't you feel a tiny bit of shame coming to Scotland and lecturing us about banking? You were the Chancellor who allowed the banking crisis to happen. It happened on your watch. Don't you feel that you owe an apology to the people of Scotland, indeed the UK?
The first point, I live in Scotland. It's my home. My family's been brought up here. So I'm not coming to Scotland, as you put it. You know, it's really, I understand the sincerity which you hold your views, but please also understand that there are some of us on the other side of the argument who are equally sincere in what we're doing. Now, in relation to the point you made about the banks, as I said in reply to the point raised by Mr. Baker, I was Chancellor at the time. I was a member of the government for the Labour government for 13 years, and of course I accept responsibility for everything that we did or didn't do during the course of that time. I've said also to you that I think the regulatory regime at that time was found wanting, although I have to say, you know, the clamour for light touch regulation was one that was advocated by every party, your own one included.
Mr. Darling, and don't you think there's a deep irony that you of all people should lecture the people of Scotland about banking?
Firstly, I'm simply answering the questions that you and your colleagues are putting to me. A lot of it turns on what happened at that time, and you know, I'm more than happy to be judged on what I did or didn't do at that time. And my concern now, if you like, as we look forward, is that firstly we don't repeat the mistakes that were made at that time. And you know, as I say to you, you know, I'll accept my responsibility, but you know, also the leader of your party was advocating light touch regulation at the time. Heavens, he even wrote to RBS, Fred Goodwin, you remember him, commending him on his takeover of ABN AMRO, which was proved to be absolutely calamitous at that time. So all politicians make mistakes, but in relation to this particular problem, what I'm seeking to point out is that moving forward, if Scotland had a financial services sector of the size that it has, then there are consequences so far as the regulatory regime are concerned, and we just have to accept those consequences. As I say, you and your colleagues would say, well, we want independence, therefore we accept those consequences, but for goodness sake, we need to tell people what those consequences are, and don't sort of pretend they don't exist.
Very briefly, Mr. Darling, I was interested in your answer to Mr. Baker. Didn't you previously say that it was a logical thing to do to enter into a currency union?
No. What you will find from your party's various press releases, the use of two words which were separated by a number of paragraphs. And it's never a great thing to do, and I know all political parties do this from time to time. Rather than take up too much of the committee's time doing this, what I suggest you do is read my entire reply to Gordon Brewer on Newsnight Scotland, which I think was in January at the beginning of 2013. Nobody listening to that could have been in the slightest doubt that what I was advocating was what we have at the moment, which is a currency union, and it works because you've got a political and economic union and a banking union that stands behind it. I was making the point at some length about the difficulty you've got with the currency union, where you've got an asymmetric relationship, where you've got one very large partner and one, you know, much smaller one, and the terms and conditions which I thought would be objectionable to nationalists, never mind anybody else. But do read the whole thing. I know I'm not often I would commend any answers I give to someone on a late night programme, but if you're going to look at it, you will then be able to see where the word logical and desirable appeared, but you find they do not appear together.
Right. Alison Johnson.
Good morning. Better Together, and you yourself suggested this morning that there are benefits for us all as individual Scots in remaining part of a larger UK, but it certainly doesn't feel like that for far too many people. The areas of multiple deprivation that in Edinburgh, and I'm Edinburgh born and bred, they remain markedly and disappointingly unchanged under the current regime. Now, clearly, too many Scots aren't seeing the benefits, and that's despite the fact that the Times Rich List have reported that they've never seen such fast growth at the top end. But what about all those people that we continue to let down at the bottom end? There's no written submission from Better Together this morning, and I just wondered what you have to offer. What guarantee is there that under the current UK settlement we're going to see change for those people who've been ignored for far too long? Because evidence would lead me to believe that it's not being given enough attention. These people are constantly being failed by Westminster policies.
Okay, where I disagree with you is that what determines action in relation to either alleviate poverty or disadvantage, or better still, to stop it in the first place, is the political actions of the government of the day, whether it's in Edinburgh or whether it's in London. It's not the Constitution that determines that. Where I think you and I would disagree is that having access to being part of something bigger, having a bigger economy, better equips you, if you're willing to take the political decision, to alleviate poverty. And if I look at what happened in the 13 years where we were in government, in the UK as a whole, we took 1 million children out of poverty. But in relation to children, the poverty, children living in absolute poverty fell from 28% to 12% during that period. In relative poverty, it fell from 28% to 12%. So that is because the government of the day took a decision that it would do increased child benefit through child care provision, through other the tax credits, all of which the present government takes a rather different view of that because it's quite hostile to a lot of these things. But that is an action of where you can reduce child poverty. Now, in addition to that, if you want, that's by alleviating the symptoms, if you like. In addition to that, surely what is important is making sure that you stop it arising in the first place. And that means, for example, improving educational attainment. That's why I, for example, wouldn't have cut over 100,000 college places in Scotland. A decision taken here, not taken in London. And if you look at health, which is another determinant of poverty, I noticed last week, I think a Scottish minister was comparing the health comes in Glasgow and Harrow. Well, why not compare the health comes at the east end of Glasgow and Lenzie, 10 miles away, which you will find there's a 10-year difference in life expectancy. Now, I mention education and health because they are totally devolved at the moment, and it is up to the government of the day, whatever government happens to be in the Scottish Parliament, to decide what it's going to do. So it's not the Constitution that determines these things, it is the political decisions taken by the administration, wherever it happens to be.
The Constitution clearly has a part to play. Thankfully, some issues are devolved, and they're allowing the Scottish Parliament to mitigate the worst impacts of welfare reform. But we're having to spend money that we could spend on other things to address the bedroom tax, for example. And the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, I believe, have suggested that the gains that we've made, the improvements that we've made to children's lives will be lost if things continue as they are. And the constitutional settlement is key, because who's to say that after May's election next year we're not going to have a Conservative UKIP coalition? You know, there are no guarantees under the current system.
In any political system you've got, there's always choices that are going to have to be made. And, you know, as I say, if you look at Scotland's overall position, we unfortunately have had a deficit in every year, bar one of the last 20. So you'd have to do something about that. You can't just live with that. And if you look at the decisions that the Scottish government have taken in relation to college places, it has a choice as to whether it does that or whether it continues to give free prescriptions to everybody. You can argue for as long as you want as to which choices it makes, but the idea under any constitutional settlement, anywhere in the world for that matter, that you aren't at some stage confronted with difficult decisions is, I just disagree with you on that.
I'm not here to defend the Scottish Government's position on college places. It's one that I disagree with, but I still don't feel I've had a response to my question. Things haven't changed in our peripheral housing schemes for decades. What are Better Together going to do about that?
Together, a narrow point, is not a political party. We're fighting the referendum. That's
Better Together offer.
In relation to housing, I agree with you that Scotland has for a long, long time had a situation where we've had far too many houses that are not up to the standard we want. In addition to that, we haven't been building as many houses as we want. But I say that is a political decision by successive governments, and this is the decisions that the Scottish Government have taken. They're entitled to take them. But it isn't the Constitution that determines these things. Two things determine it. One is how much money you've got to spend in the first place. And, you know, I said what I had to say about the economy and our economic prospects earlier on, which I think is very important. As someone who will be living in Scotland, regardless of the result, I will be very concerned if the IFS is right. In 6 or 7 years' time, we're faced with a situation where we're having to make greater cuts or increasing taxation simply to keep going, which means you would not have the money to do things that perhaps you and I would agree with. But the second thing you need to do is have the political will to tackle these things.
Sometimes we do have the political will. You're hamstrung and prevented from doing so. If you look at Westminster's policy on renewables, for example, we're not seeing the investment that Scotland needs. Instead, we're seeing a government who's determinedly investing in nuclear power stations. And, you know, a recent report from from 5 experts have pointed out that actually electricity would be cheaper in an independent Scotland because the UK is going to be paying for the Hinkley Point reactor for some 30 years or more.
Well, I think, again, you and I might disagree on this, and I think we all benefit from having a mix of energy provision. I know your party doesn't believe that, and as you know, Scotland, a lot of Scotland's baseload electricity comes from 2 nuclear power stations at the moment, the future of which, you know, we've yet to hear what's going to happen to them. In relation to renewables, just make the point that the renewable energy industry, and particularly in Scotland, benefits from the fact that the subsidy comes effectively from all UK consumers, because we all pay into that. I know that because I set it up. And it's one that's very beneficial to Scotland, because, as you know, we've got more investment here proportionately than, you know, the population would suggest. And if you actually lost the UK energy market, that would be very damaging to the renewables industry in Scotland.
Agree to differ. Could I ask one more question? One point that you have made time and time again is about pensions and how secure they will be if we remain part of the UK. Now, ICAS currently estimate a £300 billion private pension deficit, which isn't exactly prudential management by the UK. Stirling University have shown that the extra costs in Scotland can be offset by levels of immigration that have been the norm for the last decade. Do you not agree that an independent Scotland, a wealthy country, an independent Scotland, can create a system to provide well for people in their old age?
Well, there's 3 things that I'm going to ask Blair to say something, since otherwise you'll be wondering why he's been here, in relation to pensions. Firstly, in relation to the state pension, as you know, the state pension isn't funded. It's paid as a pay-as-you-go basis. And you are right that the IFS and others have said that, given the fact we've got an ageing population and our working age population is falling relative to that, you either correct that by, you know, making people pay more tax to fund the thing, because that's actually what pays it, or you increase the level of migration. However, I am unaware of the Scottish Government or anyone else on that side of the argument actually saying how much more immigration you would need. But you are right that the only way, if you can't replace your working age population through, you know, increasing the birth rate, you have to do it through migration. And if you don't do that, you have the problem that Japan's got at the moment, where they have very little migration, they've got an ageing population, they've got debt of 200% of their GDP. So that by all means come back. But let me just answer the other 2 points. On the other ICAS point was in relation to funded pensions, you know, the occupational pensions. For many years now, too many of these pensions have not been properly funded, or at the moment you've got a situation where they are UK-wide. Under EU law, if Scotland became independent, these pensions would split, and you've got to make sure that both sides are funded. Now, the only people who can make sure they're funded are either the pension members through increased contributions or reduced drawings out, or I suppose if the Scottish Government felt it had enough cash around to do that, it would have to top them up. So, you know, I think that those are both issues that certainly concern me, both in our ability to fund the state pension and to increase it, because that's, I think, what most people would want. In addition to that, you've also got the problem in relation to funded pensions, where you're taking on a whole bunch of risks and expenditure which you don't need at the moment, because we don't have to fund them separately. Sorry, you were going to come back.
Have the case in Ireland where there was a transition period. I think this is perfectly possible, but the immigration issue is key. And again, I'd come back to the point that if next May we see a Conservative UKIP coalition elected, surely that is a greater threat to the stability of Scots pensions than anything else may be.
Well, it won't surprise you to know I'm not enthusiastic about a Conservative or a UKIP, let alone a coalition, some coalition, since UKIP seem to have difficulty working with themselves, never mind working with anybody else. But in relation to pensions, you know, one of the things about pensions, we all know, is they span several governments by their very nature. Whatever government introduces a reform, it's several governments on before you know whether it worked or not. But I think in relation to the immigration point that you rightly put, if you've got a falling working age population and a rising retired population, as I say, there's only 2 ways you can get the money. It either comes out of something else you'd otherwise be doing, or you try and encourage more migration. Now, if that is your policy, like so much else, that's a policy decision you're entitled to take, but you better be upfront about it, because people would like to know.
if you're part of a, a larger UK that has an immigration policy that doesn't match your country's needs, that's a real challenge.
And there are consequences too. If you have two different immigration policies across a landless border, at some point, I suspect, an obvious issue is going to arise. But an independent Scotland needing to boost its working age population by X, because I don't know what the number is, and it might be useful to know what that number is between now and the 18th September. If you are going to increase immigration to fill that gap, that is a policy decision that the Scottish Government is entitled to make, but so far it has been very coy on A, the fact it's going to do that, and B, if it is going to do it, how many people are we talking about? Because it has a knock-on effect on housing, on schools, on health, and so on. So can I...
Yeah, I mean, I think Alistair has covered most of the points I would make. Just on this point of immigration, with the Scottish ageing population, you've got over 65s set to grow significantly over the coming decades in Scotland, and you've got the working age population actually set to shrink in comparison to that, whereas with the rest of the UK, you've got all sections of the population, broadly speaking, set to grow. And so the question about what immigration policy we need from the pensions point of view arises from the decision of independence. And so the question then is, as Alistair says, if the affordability of pensions is predicated on interventions in the population through immigration, then you've got to question whether that is actually a credible policy. Now, two independent researchers have now put a figure of 1 million immigrants on that in order to make pensions affordable at the rate of equivalent to the UK. The Scottish Government, to the best of my knowledge, has not put a figure on that, so it's very difficult to judge whether the promise to make pensions affordable through immigration is actually a credible one or not. And I think until we see what the Scottish Government's figure is, it's difficult to tell whether pensions are actually safe or not within an independent Scotland.
Okay. Bill, you asked a question.
Thanks.
I just wondered before, I'd like to talk about forecasting, but before I do that, I wonder if you might explain why, in your answer to Dennis Robertson about foreign direct investment, up until 2008, Scotland had about 8% of the UK jobs that came from foreign direct investment. In 2010, it rose to 19%. In 2011, it was 20%. In 2012, it was 18%. And the latest forecast for 2013 is 20%. To what do you attribute that dramatic change in direct investment towards Scotland as opposed to the rest of the UK?
Also benefited, I seem to remember, from those figures that came out last year. So, as I said, Scotland benefits to a very large extent, not just because of what we offer in Scotland, but we're part of the United Kingdom, part of a bigger market. In the same ways, we benefit hugely from overseas investment. Hold on, let me finish. All right. I was going to just add the point that we have a lot of investment, for example, in the motor industry that's here purely and simply because we're also part of the European Union. People like getting into a market where they not only get into that immediate market, but they also get into a bigger market as well. It has a big benefit.
I recall Scotland was part of the UK before 2008 as well, so you really haven't explained the difference. But anyway, let me get on to forecasting. In 2010, the Financial Times, you said, you're talking about the OBR. You said right from the start the Tories used the OBR not just as part of the government, but as part of the Conservative Party. And in fact, if we look at the first chairman of the OBR was Sir Alan Budd, who was an advisor to Mrs Thatcher. And if we look at the constituency of the existing board, you might have been right. Have you changed your view?
I do remember that. That was, if I remember rightly, that was the first OBR report that was published about 3 weeks after the general election, prior to George Osborne's first budget. And I remember there was a fuss at the time, and I remember discussing it with Alan Budd at the time, who said that I think matters hadn't been handled in the way that were perhaps ideal. Since then, the OBR has moved on. Robert Choate, who currently chairs it, I think is doing an excellent job. And I think, There's a broader point here in relation to forecasting, because I dare say you'll come on to this. Forecasting at a time of economic crisis is incredibly difficult because there are so many unknown things that are happening. You know, if you look at the time that I was forecasting an extremely turbulent period, you know, in 2008, my forecasts were in line broadly with others, but by the end of 2008, it was quite clear that the world had changed dramatically. Equally, if you take the OBR, the forecasting that is done post-2010, as you know, things were considerably worse in the first 2 years than people anticipated. We're now at the situation where they're saying, and so is the Bank of England, things are getting better. So it is a difficult thing to do anyway, but I do remember the point, there was a particular point, I think just after the general election in 2010, where I think there was a general feeling that the OBR had gone off to a bad start, but that has been put behind them. So I think this is a case of where the facts have changed, and when the facts change, I do change my mind. Perhaps I should acknowledge it was somebody else who said that originally.
That's very welcome. Thank you for that. But we are, as you say, we're in better times. So if I look at the economic fiscal outlook for Scottish tax forecasts for the OBR, I have a statement here that says, and you say they've improved, we are therefore not able to produce a Scottish macroeconomic forecast to drive the Scottish tax forecast because of the methodology. We consider these methodologies work in progress. So why are we putting so much emphasis on the OBR when they haven't established a meaningful methodology, which they themselves say is work in progress?
Well, look, the OBR, first of all, is there to do forecasts for the whole of the UK, and it operates off the data that we have. What it hasn't done, and what's more difficult to do, is to disaggregate the tax take from the different parts of the UK. It's relatively easy to do it for income tax, but it's much more difficult, even with corporation tax. It's not always clear where the money's been made, and for indirect taxations, it's more difficult still. So the OBR's job, it wasn't actually set up to do that sort of studying, but as you know, people like the IFS, who do have a record on this, have been, and other people too, the National Institute and so on, they have done quite a lot of work on that. You know, as you know, forecasting tax take is like forecasting, you know, growth and everything is never going to be an exact science. What it can do is give you pointers as to the sort of environment you're likely to be operating in.
Sorry, a big one.
Sure. I mean, I think your first question was about the politicisation of forecasts, and your second question, I guess, was about maybe illustrated the point about the need to be cautious with things. The Scottish Government, in its forecasting published by John Swinney for oil projections going forward, took 5 scenarios from scenario 1, which was the most pessimistic for oil revenues coming out of the North Sea, to scenario 5, which was the most optimistic. For the year 2012-2013, even scenario 1, the most most pessimistic scenario of how much oil revenue would flow out of the North Sea, was out by about £1 billion. So I think it reinforces your initial point about the need not to be too political with forecasting, because the problem with those oil forecasts is that they are the underpinning for the sole page of economic forecasting, which is within the white paper on page 75. So it's already been shown to be too optimistic.
The government is depressing the forecasts for oil and revenue. I'll come to that in a minute.
This was real tax take that has been proven to be out of kilter with the forecast that was made.
Go on. Well, I was going to say that it is also regrettable the OBR, in its own statement, says, due to the confidentiality of the measures and methodologies they're using, we were unable to involve the Scottish Government in this stage of the process. So I'll leave it there. One of the other things that we have heard a lot of is businesses will move from Scotland in the event of referendum. I have here a Herald newspaper the day after your budget, Mr Darling, in 2010. And one of the headlines is, large companies may ask why stay in the UK. And they're talking about the relocation because of corporation tax, and making various comments about moving their headquarters. Why do we have so much scaremongering? I mean, we understand uncertainty when things change, and those of us who have run businesses understand that uncertainty. But why are we having so much emphasis on this when, in fact, there's a very select few and individuals within organisations who are talking about they might not stay in Scotland? Your own evidence suggests, or the evidence of your budget in 2010, suggests exactly the same situation was happening.
I think make two observations to you. For larger organisations, they do, over probably not immediate reaction, but in a longer time scale, they do make choices about the jurisdictions in which they operate, whether it's the regulatory regime, the tax regime, what's it like as a place of doing business. So, you know, it is influential, and you can't ignore it, particularly in a world where it's a very globalised economy, and people are not just choosing between Scotland and England, but they're choosing the Far East or Europe or South America or anything, or somewhere like that. But in relation to the companies themselves, I mean, I give you, two examples. Standard Life, and it was them that said it, not me. And Standard Life didn't discuss it with us before they made the point. What they're saying is they compete with other big insurance pension companies based south of the border. They said not that they would move everything, but they might have to move some of their operations south of the border if they were faced with a different tax regime or regulatory regime. And as you will know, the pensions industry is largely driven by the tax and the pensions regime. Or if you take a smaller company which I met in Port Glasgow that makes mechanical pumps, where most of its customers are south of the border, most of the component parts come from south of the border, and the guy that owns it was just making the point, he's having to deal with two separate regimes for tax and accounting and so on, and he said, it would make a difference to me, and I don't think I could carry on doing it. Now, obviously each firm, each individual will have a different view as to how it affects them. What the population as a whole of Scotland have to decide is, on the balance of probabilities, what's likely to be best for an economic environment where you have a thriving business sector that employs people, that pays its taxes, that contributes to the wealth of the country. And you will understand which side of the argument I'm on as far as that's concerned, though I quite understand that you're firmly on the other one.
And I hear what you say, but if I look at the list of companies at that time, we're talking about Diageo, Guinness, Diageo, Unilever, HSBC, and who in fact actually moved. I think it's time we started being realistic and stop a lot of the scaremongering that goes on in that situation. One last question, if I may. You made a comment about my First Minister talking and supporting the Royal Bank of Scotland, Fred Goodwin. In your autobiography on page 62, you indicate that Mr Goodwin came to you on December 23rd, I believe, with a panettone. And he told you then that there was a problem with the liquidity of the banks. Why didn't you do something about it immediately?
Well, firstly, thank you for the plug for my book, which is still available from all good booksellers. And I hope you got beyond page 62 and you weren't just standing in W.H. Smith looking at it. Fred Goodwin did come to my house on the December of 2007, I think it was. And what he was talking about, he had two concerns. One is he was concerned about the lack of liquidity in the system, which is something the Bank of England actually addressed a very short time after that, because I don't know if you may remember that in a coordinated action, the bank, the US Fed, the Bank of Japan, the Swiss Bank, the ECB, all said they would have a combined scheme. So it did provide liquidity. Where I think the problem was that it was always the view of RBS, or certainly Fred Goodwin's view, that RBS simply had a cash flow problem. It was lack of day-to-day money, which they certainly had. But what he did not accept at that stage, which is also recorded in that chapter, is that I said to him that why does everybody think you've got a capital problem? Now, he said he didn't have a capital problem, but the markets at that time thought they did, principally because of the takeover of ABN, to which, as you said, your First Minister was adding his blessing, because ABN was a basket case, an absolute basket case, and it wasn't the sole thing that brought down RBS, because they lost money in conventional lending, they lost money spectacularly in relation to some of the trading and derivative instruments, particularly in the United States, which they started in 2006, I think. But the long and the short of it was this was a once great bank, one of the biggest banks, if not the biggest bank in the world, brought to its knees. And I come back to the point that Mr. Fraser made it the first time. At least the RBS is still here. It still employs a lot of people in this city. And it's only did that because I was in a position to be able to do something about it. And, if we'd trusted in Mr. Goodwin on the board of RBS and were not in that position, a lot more jobs that have gone, and the consequences for the Scottish economy, never mind the UK economy, would have been catastrophic.
Well, just let me...
I wanted to ask you about the Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, Nicholas McPherson, who raised eyebrows when his advice to the Chancellor was published on the same day as George Osborne made the speech emphatically ruling out a currency union. Now, in a Freedom of Information request in November 2012, the Treasury stated that Sir Nicholas met yourself occasionally, socially, from time to time. When did you and Sir Nicholas last meet?
I think I bumped into him in March.
And how many times have you met him since the referendum campaign began?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. I don't want to give you an inaccurate advantage. Just say one thing, Ms McAlpine. Yeah, I do. Obviously, I worked very closely with Nick McPherson for 3 years, and previously when I was Chief Secretary of the Treasury in the late 1990s. For the sake of completeness, I also keep up with a number of other permanent secretaries in the departments that I worked, including other civil servants. It's not abnormal. The one thing I'd make very clear is that every single civil servant that I have contact with are absolutely scrupulous about not discussing what they advise the current government, and that's one of the strengths of the civil service in this country. So I wouldn't read too much into the fact that, yes, I know Nick McPherson, and I saw him nearly every day of my life for 3 years during some quite interesting times.
Discussed aspects of the independence referendum with him?
All of them, in terms of Better Together, in terms of the contact we have with the UK government, that's done through political channels, not through the civil service.
I asked if you had discussed aspects of the independence referendum with your friend Nicholas McPherson.
Well, I discussed many things. I'm not going to go into private conversations, but in terms of the... As I said to you, is I'm not going to go into private discussions I have with him or anybody else for that matter, but what I can tell you is in relation to whatever advice he happened to give to the current government, I've not discussed that, no.
I'm asking what he said to you. Did you discuss aspects of the independence referendum with your friend Nick McPherson?
I'm not going to discuss private conversations any more than I would discuss a private conversation I have with anybody.
Did you discuss the currency union with Nick McPherson?
I can't really add to what I've said, Ms McAlpine. What I can say to you is that what the advice that Nick McPherson and his colleagues give to the current Chancellor and Chief Secretary is advice that I'm not aware of. It's something, if we have contact with the government, we do it through political channels, not through the civil service.
I was asking you about your conversations with your friend Nick McPherson, but we'll move on to...
You understand that, yeah?
Yeah. If I can move on to a report in The Guardian by the Chief Political Correspondent Nicholas Watt on the 29th of the 3rd this year. It quoted a Treasury source as saying, Alistair and Andrew are running the show, we just did what they said. They were referring to Andrew Dunlop, the PM's Special Advisor for Scotland, who also advised Margaret Thatcher, and yourself. Can I ask when you and Mr Dunlop first ruled out a currency union, discussed ruling out a currency union?
We didn't, and it's news to me that I'm running the show so far as the Treasury was concerned. I mean, I did, but I don't now. Well, I think it's a matter of fact that I don't, quotes, run the show. Of course, I've discussed with Ed Balls, George Osborne, Danny Alexander, the currency union. It would be extraordinary if I hadn't done so. And you may recall, you want to know where people were thinking about these things. When George Osborne, I think, first spoke on the subject, it was last summer, when he said what he said, his own words, his own thoughts, when he said he thought it would be very difficult. This is prior to him then saying actually he wouldn't do it. And it would be extraordinary too, I think, if I hadn't discussed with Ed Balls, who's the Shadow Chancellor, a member of my own party, if I hadn't discussed him the merits of these things. And for the sake of completeness, I've also discussed it with Danny Alexander. So, but it won't surprise you to know that on that particular issue, in relation to currency, we have a common view.
Ed Balls, because Ed Balls, when he appeared on Ian Dale's LBC radio show on the 12th of February 2012, which was the day before George Osborne made a speech about currency, he revealed he hadn't read the Treasury paper that day, but he, of course, immediately came out to back up George Osborne the next day. As a member of the Labour Party, a very senior member, did the Labour Party carry out their own analysis before ruling out a currency union, or did they just adopt George Osborne's analysis?
You may recall that Ed Bowles, when he was a special advisor in the Treasury, was very largely instrumental in determining what was the then government's policy response to the euro. So he is well versed with the problems that are associated with the currency union. And indeed, you may recall, since you seem to be reading quite a lot of clippings from the press and so on, that when he came up, I think it was during the Dunfermline by-election, and again at the end of last year, on both occasions, he expressed extreme scepticism about currency union. So I don't think, and you know, the government papers are published by the government, so Ed wouldn't have seen them. But the idea was coming fresh to this is just not right. I mean, he has got a lot of experience.
This was a coordinated, staged, managed event in which he was wheeled out to support the Chancellor. Can I ask you, is it the usual practice for the Labour Party to follow the policy of a Tory Chancellor without scrutiny?
You know, in relation to a currency union and the currency, what would happen post-independence, it's surely not surprising that the principal finance spokesman for all three parties would have looked at this matter and taken a view on it. And yet, you know, the view was universal, that the economics don't add up. Now, the actual production, the preparation of the Treasury paper that you refer, that's obviously a matter for the UK government, because that's what governments do. But the fact that they have a common view shouldn't surprise anyone. And although the process is fascinating to some, I would have thought what's more interesting is the actual substance of a currency union, which, as I said in reply to earlier questions, I think would be bad for Scotland. Never mind the rest of the UK.
I just ask Mr. McDougall, but Better Together published a dossier immediately after Osborne's announcement, claiming that the currency union wasn't possible. Had you been told what the UK government was announcing?
In the matter of days before it happened, yes.
So you had discussions with the UK government on the announcement by the Chancellor?
As I've told you, through the political...
So I'm asking Mr. McDougall.
Well, he answers as well, but I'm just...
Yeah, no, I'm asking Mr. McDougall,
right,
who's just admitted that Better Together had discussions with the UK government before Mr. Osborne's speech.
Not about whether the decision should be made, but about that the decision was coming.
Thank you.
Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, and good morning, panel. Throughout this inquiry, we've heard from different witnesses that taxation and the welfare state would be much better if we were independent. And could you perhaps tell us your view on what the levels of income tax would be? Because really, what the people that we're talking to when we're out and about, they're worried about how much it's going to cost them personally. So, and we've heard from, as I said, various witnesses that tax levels, income tax levels, are likely to be higher if this aspiration by the Yes campaign and the SNP would lead to welfare benefits, for example, being more akin to the Nordic states.
Well, I suppose this comes back to the point I made right at the very start, that if you look at tax and welfare, if you are part of something bigger than the United Kingdom as a whole, you have about 31 million taxpayers, over which you, and as well as in addition to that, as business taxpayers as well, over which you can spread the burden of the money you need to raise to pay for pensions, the welfare state, health, education, and so on. Scotland has a taxable population of, I think, about 2.5 million people, so it's a lot smaller. Now, if you look at the what's often said about the Nordic states, people have said, well, we can have what they have. You can, as long as you also accept the taxes that go with it. That in all those states is higher than ours, typically 25%. The top rate of tax is higher than we pay at the moment. And so I always say to people, if you want to advocate that Nordic settlement that says there are, in some cases, better public services, they're not everywhere, frankly, and to go with it, you get the higher taxation, by all means advocate it, but tell people what you're going to do. Because people might vote for it, but they want to know in advance, well, what's it going to cost me? How much more am I going to have to pay in individual taxation and so on? I think there's another consideration, again, which I think I adverted to earlier on, in relation to the IFS report, which no one's seriously challenged. I mean, the IFS is one of the few organisations that I'm aware of that, possibly because it's very good and possibly because every political party at one stage or another, usually in opposition, has endorsed, and it's actually very difficult then to say we don't believe what they say when we're in government. But they've made the point that in about 5 or 6 years' time, Scotland will have a very big gap between what it spends and what it gets in, which will have to be filled. They estimated at about £6 billion. Now, if you have a gap of that size, there are a limited number of higher rate taxpayers in Scotland. The Scottish Government has already said it's going to cut corporation tax by 3 pence. So that means somebody else is going to have to pay. And that somebody else is the rest, you know, the ordinary people who are going to have to pay either an income tax or increase VAT. Now, VAT in this country at the moment is now 20%. I think people would be very, very concerned if it went up to 25%. Because you know that would be a big hit. But so I just think that you can look at any country you want and make your comparisons. But the thing to remember, you know, I'm sure everybody appreciates that there's no country in the world where everything's perfect. They've all got their problems. You know, Sweden's got big social problems. You know, so have some of the other Nordic countries. But if you advocate higher taxation, as it is open to anyone to do, then by all means do so. But remember to tell people first.
I'm trying to get a figure out of you. I mean, what level do you think it would be at in an independent Scotland?
Again, it would depend on, I forget, someone asked earlier on, we're, at the moment, we are running a fiscal deficit. We're spending more than we get in. And this year alone, if you look at the latest figures, we lost £4.5 billion worth of revenue from the North Sea oil, which is roughly what we spend in schools in Scotland. That gap would have to be plugged. It would have to be plugged if you were an independent Scotland. You have to plug it now, and you have to plug it from somewhere. So the amount of money you raise in tax is driven by two things. One is what are you spending your money on, you know, in terms of your services, and also how much would you have to spend on servicing debt. You know, and the best estimate I've seen is the IFS one, because it has looked at the demographic pressures facing Scotland. It's also looked at the fact that, you know, whatever is happening in the North Sea oil, by definition, it's not renewable, and every day there's less than there was the day before. So it's very difficult to put a precise number on it. They put a number on it, £6 billion, which it would either come off, either go up, mean increased taxes, or reduce spending.
And if I can just ask another question around, if there was an independent Scotland, how difficult would it be to actually set up a separate tax system, given, you know, the intricacies of where we are just now in the UK, and what would be the cost implications from that? Because, I mean, I think we've all seen the ICAS report this week. If you could
figure of about 750 million, I think. Well, I think there's two things. One is the Scottish Government's view is that HMRC, presently constituted, and on the benefit side, the DWP would continue to pay out benefits and collect taxes for maybe 5 years, which actually limits the scope to what you can do anyway, because certainly the DWP, I know from my own experience, can't operate. It can pay out universal benefits, but it's very bad at chopping and changing. But you would have to replicate these things. And, you know, that's money being spent on, you know, a new bureaucracy you don't need. And I would rather see that money spent on some of the things that Ms Johnson was saying. I thought I'd switched the thing off. I'm very sorry about that. What? Yes, which, you know, the point that that Alistair Johnson was making, if there's £750 million available to spend, I would rather not be spending it on replicating what already exists. I think the ICAS also made the point that you would expect to have less civil servants administering it, and I think they put the figure at 2,500 or something. But again, if that's what you're going to do, then tell people.
Well, yeah, that's my point, I think, because I think the people in the street want to know just what it's going to cost them. And okay, it's okay to look at the bigger picture, and we talk about the economy and what that would mean, but in actual fact, people's most concern is around how it will affect them personally, and I think they're looking at how realistic both sides' views are. So if we could just perhaps in reality, how long would it actually take to set up these institutions within Scotland, you know, post-referendum?
Well, I have some experience here in that when Job Centre Plus was set up for the whole of the UK about 10 years ago, it took about 2 or 3 years to set it up. The more problematic thing is not so much the people, but it's the computer systems that go with it. And we're not the only country, but there's a long history, and an unhappy history it is too, of brand new computers, which when they get unpacked are supposed to do all sorts of things, but then you find they don't actually quite do that. You'd also remember that when you're doing this, you're presumably changing the tax code at the same time. There's big issues in relation to tax of, you know, who's a Scottish taxpayer, who's a UK taxpayer, and so on. I think these are questions where, to be honest, nobody knows how long it would take, but we're kidding ourselves if you can do these things quickly, because these things always take longer than you think. And where there is delay or uncertainty, you've got costs, you've got risks, you've got blight, frankly. And the blight that would come when decisions are yet to be made. Remember, ICAS, who know about the tax system, make all sorts of points about VAT and all the rest of it. These are all issues which we could greatly benefit with far more information now, rather than find out on the 19th of September that it would have been a good idea we'd known it all.
To the uncertainty and turmoil that would follow on from if it was an independent Scotland.
There'd be uncertainty, and the idea that you could fix all this by March 2016 is for the birds. To start with, my experience in the European Union is that nothing that I'm aware of has ever been fixed in 18 months, even when they agree.
I mean, maybe two pertinent sources for your last two questions. In terms of the cost of setting up the tax system, and yesterday John Swinney was, I think, in the media saying that he believed that setting up a tax system could actually save Scotland money. In the leaked cabinet paper of 2012, he predicted that the costs of a separate taxation system could be in the region of £625 million for Scotland, which I think is around about £300 million more than the share that we pay in to maintain the UK tax system. So I'm not quite sure how what was written in private quite squares with what was said in public yesterday. On the point about the length of time in setting up institutions, the Scottish Government's own expert group on welfare in its first report looked at some of these types of issues in terms of setting up systems for the payment of benefits and pensions. And I think I'm right in saying that their conclusion was that you're looking at a period of time around about a decade in terms of getting institutions set up, and any attempt to move to separate systems before that was, I think in their words, a serious threat to the continuity of payments for people. And obviously these are the things that would be rolled into any negotiations after independence, but I mean, you're looking at 10 years and you're looking at a lot of cost.
Two members to get in before 11 o'clock. Marco Bianchi.
In response to Alison Johnston's questions earlier, you were very keen to talk about poverty rather than inequality, Mr. Darling. You also said about the IFS, it's very difficult to say, we don't believe what they say, your words. So the Institute of Fiscal Studies report, Poverty and Inequality in the UK, published in 2011, found that, quote, income inequality rose during the 13 years of Labour government across a range of potential measures. What guarantees do you see for any kind of change in the event of a no vote, given the record of Labour?
Again, the decision, the reason the income inequality rose largely was because of a very rapid increase in the top decile of the population, which is something you see right across the OECD. And we see it in this country particularly because in the last 20 years we've had an influx of people who are on the very high income scale. That if you want to do something about that, the question is what your top rate of tax is. Now, as you know, I put the top rate of tax up to 50 pence, and the last budget I did, is now coming back down again. But again, that's a political decision. Equally, in Scotland, if you wanted to narrow that inequality, and I don't think Scotland's got anything like the same number of very high earners, it is open to a Scottish government to say, well, we're going to have a top rate of more than 50 pence if it wants. I just think if that's what your intention is, then you should tell people beforehand rather than after.
Draw your attention, actually, in going as your very first response to the issue about the top going up as the reason for inequality, to the final Prime Minister's questions by Margaret Thatcher, where I believe that was her exact defence, and I assume you were there. But looking at this, for the last 55 years, Scotland has voted Labour in every general election. Do you think that inequality would be higher or lower in Scotland if we had had Labour governments every time we'd voted for them?
It's an impossible question to answer. What I can say is point to
equality.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I was about to say that if you look at the Labour government of which I was a member, it did reduce. It reduced poverty, and particularly on people on the lower income levels, we increased income levels. And there's a very good study, if you want to read it, prepared by the LSE, which so it's impartial. It's not our one. It's done by Professor John Hills and others, in which he goes through. It's a report card, if you like. And actually, yes, there were things that weren't right, but there's a lot of things that we did get right. And if we're elected again, we'd like to continue doing that.
Your test, would 55 years of Labour government, or indeed Scotland getting a Labour government whenever it votes for one, have reduced poverty more than the last 55 years have?
It's impossible to say, because if you look past the
governments wouldn't have reduced poverty.
I would hope that it would be the object of any Labour government and every Labour government to reduce poverty. That's one of the central planks of what we stood on in 1997, and we were standing on next year. So and don't misunderstand me. I want to see Labour governments. But, I rather got the impression that you were in favour of independence regardless of whether it was a Labour government or not, because you didn't like us when we were in government any more than you like the Tories.
I'm not sure there's any party anywhere in the world who's been in power, certainly democracy has been in power for 55 years anyway, so it's an interesting hypothetical. I mean, for me, and I guess this is where I take my Better Together hat off and put my Labour Party activist hat on, inequality and poverty are tackled through policy decisions made by parties. And what we're looking at now is not about a hypothetical past, but what we're being offered in the future. Now, my party is offering, as Alistair says, 50p top rate of tax, a tax on the bankers' bonuses in order to guarantee.
Here as a Better Together representative, and not a representative of the Labour Party.
If you look at the finish, I'm about to segue into the referendum. There are policies being espoused which are redistributive. There is not a single policy within the white paper which you stand by, which has any redistribution in it. In fact, there is one which is redistributive, but it's redistributive from the poor to the rich through the corporation tax cut. So we can talk about reducing inequality, but there has to be a recognition that there is nothing within the white paper that's being held up as the promise of reduced inequality within Scotland, which is actually redistributive.
I disagree over your interpretation of the white paper, obviously, but my question remains, what is the offer from the no side to reduce poverty and inequality? Is it to continue voting for the Labour Party, which hasn't worked for the last 55 years?
You're criticising Blair about the Labour Party, but your questions appear to be more about the Labour Party than they were about Better Together. And I repeat what I said earlier, Better Together is not standing in the general election next year. Our purpose is to fight in the referendum campaign. But I suppose I would come back to the broader point. Our ability to tackle inequality, to make sure that we live in a fairer and better society, I think is far better delivered as being part of the UK because of the resource, because of the potential, because of the opportunities, than it would be if we were to break off and go it alone. Now, obviously, we disagree on that, but that's my position.
Question. You clearly believe there are benefits to being in the union. I would disagree with you on that. I think we've had quite a few honest disagreements here. How many years, what proportion of years of Conservative government that Scotland didn't vote for do you think is a price worth paying for what you consider to be the benefits of union?
A general point. At the last election, general election, the Conservative, more people actually, though I don't approve of this, voted for the coalition government than voted for the SNP. The Tories were in the last place, then you, then the Liberals, then us. And if you look at over the years, there have been times when people, in England have found that they didn't get the government quotes that they voted for. But I don't think that your argument is a strong one in saying, well, we should break up the UK and everything that goes with it. Now, you and I don't think we would agree on what sort of government you want to see in May next year, because, as I say, I don't think you like the Labour ones either. But I think that the potential that we have of being part of the United Kingdom, it means it's far more likely that we would have the ability to deal with the inequalities and the injustices that possibly you and I might agree on. Now, we disagree on the way of achieving that, obviously.
Okay. Thank you, Convener. Questions are for Mr Darling. You're currently running a poster campaign with the message "More powers for Scotland guaranteed." Now, I'm assuming you're not talking about the powers conferred by the Scotland Act, because they'll come into being regardless of the outcome of the referendum. What are these more powers that you're guaranteeing?
Yet. And, and indeed, I'm glad you agree that, because the last couple of times I cross-swords with the Nationalists, they were busy asserting the Scotland Act wasn't going to come into force, or it hadn't been agreed yet. Yet,
what these more powers are that you're guaranteeing?
There's the taxation powers that come in the 2012 Act, but all three non-nationalist parties, if you like, are promising that they'll have additional powers. They're not all the same, something that no doubt they might want to agree between them. But it is the case that the additional taxation powers coming to the Scottish Parliament, the power for stamp duty in relation to borrowing, all came under the 2000 Act. And I say these are guaranteed, but there's more beyond that.
But in terms of, you've talked a lot this morning about, and indeed over the last year or two, about the need for certainty. Don't you think that the people of Scotland need some certainty from the No campaign, and specifically in terms of what those extra powers are that you're guaranteeing if there is a no vote?
The Labour Party and the Liberal Party have announced their plans. The Tories, I understand, are going to do so shortly. So before the referendum campaign, you will see what the three of them are offering. Now, it may well be, as presaged the Scotland Act of 1998, that they will come together, and possibly, who knows, for once, there'll be a fourth party there, because the fourth party was not there on the other two occasions, either for Calman or in the Scottish Constitutional Convention. But it is the case that more powers are guaranteed, not just the ones that are coming through, but also in relation to what the three non-nationalist parties are saying.
With regard to the Labour Party offering then, because I'm assuming that you're at least able to speak for that, Reform Scotland's analysis suggests that they offer a further 4% in terms of tax-raising powers and ability. What do you think that 4% is going to do in terms of dealing with the type of inequality that Marco Biagi and Alison Johnson have talked about? And I'm sorry to have heard you attempt to deny that there are these problems in Scotland earlier on. That what is it that Better Together can offer the people, the 400% increased people using food banks? What is it Better Together can offer people who are experiencing fuel poverty in Scotland's islands at a rate of 50%? How do you think that 4% extra powers is going to tackle in any way those problems?
But just since you said something when you said something that wasn't quite right, at no point have I ever said that Scotland doesn't have huge social and economic problems still to be tackled. Of course it does. I mentioned health inequality. The fact that if you look at the health outcomes in a large part of Scotland, they compare very badly. And some of them are really a disgrace for a country of our status and our maturity. If you look at our life expectancy of some of our citizens, people dying 10 years before their counterparts living in other parts of Scotland, not as well as other parts of the UK. And in relation to our educational attainment, we do very well by a lot of our pupils, but there's a lot of people still leaving school without the qualifications you would expect. So nobody is going to tell me that the job is done or even anything like that. The thing that we've come back to again and again and again is that I don't believe it is the constitutional arrangements that determine people's success or people's life expectancy or well-being, or it is about the political decisions that the government of the day, either here in Edinburgh or in London, take in relation to any of the matters that you referred to. Now, what the Scottish Labour Party's proposals are, it gives the Scottish government, will give the Scottish government more power, more responsibility over raising the money that it spends, which I think is all to the good. But at the end of the day, whatever government is elected in 2016 or London, Westminster, 2015, it is the political decisions they make that will determine many of the things we've been discussing today, not the constitutional arrangements. And you know, it's almost like if only you change the constitution, then you'll have all the money and everything that you need to do things. It's not like that.
Could you please explain to me? Could you please explain to me how this 4% extra more powers, this tinkering around the edges, will help deal with the problems that we've heard described this morning?
I don't know where you get your 4% from. That it seems to me that what the Scottish Labour Party was putting forward, plus you look at some of the things the Liberals are putting forward, and we'll wait and see what the Conservatives have got to say, these are additional powers which I think most people will welcome. But what I think people in Scotland want above all else is they want to know what is the best way of achieving the ends we all want to achieve. There's a competing vision between building on the strengths and opportunities you get from being part of the UK and making our decisions here in Scotland, or whether you achieve these things by breaking away. Now, you know which side I'm on that, but I think that is what is like to be foremost in people's minds when they go to the polls in September.
It's been a long session. We've covered a lot of ground. I'm very grateful to you both for coming along and answering our questions this morning. I will have a short suspension to allow a changeover. Thank you.